And I'm saying this is a picture of a Clarence Larkin. I think you've seen these before. He was like a theologian. Clarence Larkin. He was a theologian, but he was also like a drafter, architect, in the 1800s. He drew all these crazy, amazing pictures detailing, kind of like what like Pearl does with like the Revelation overview. But this is one of his things on like the dispensations. Yeah. He's got a bunch of these kind of pictures that are pretty cool. Mm-hmm. So, brief review. Obviously, we're talking about dispensations. Mm-hmm. That's okay. But in the context of understanding the rapture and just getting an idea of how to rightly divide the Bible. So, in the context of the rapture, what is the first thing that's important to understand in order to understand the rapture, in particular pre-tribulation rapture? And it is dispensations. 2 Timothy tells us that we need to study and rightly divide the word of truth, and by doing that you won't be ashamed, which implies that you will be ashamed if you can't rightly divide the Bible up. You'll be ashamed by applying the wrong things to yourself. And as we go through the dispensations, I want to hit some specific points that are specific to each one that'll help us to like remember them, and maybe I'll print out a little sheet or something eventually and have you fill them in as like a little test or something, just so you can remember like what.
Use our notes.
Yeah.
Those who have taken notes.
Use their notes.
Jenna will be the one doing my test.
Me too.
I do all your tests.
Oh no, you don't.
She did my road test.
What?
Like from what was that thing?
To bring out
Yeah,
points
just
on
like a
classes.
Oh,
It
really?
was like,
That's
I
sweet.
just did it at work. Babe, you passed.
No.
Good job.
Flying
Congratulations. So what was the first dispensation? We only got through one of them last week. So first dispensation, first time period in the Bible.
Adamic. Or the age of innocence.
Right. That's the first one in the Bible, the age of innocence or the Adamic dispensation. And I'll hit the points as we go through. I didn't talk real specifically about each one last time. We just kind of included them in the notes. But when we talked about a dispensation, I talked about it was specific to a group of people. In each dispensation, God chooses a specific person or group of people that he's working through. And I compared it to that of a stewardship. And we looked at the parable of the talents in Matthew, where, Jesus was saying, God gave, or master gave servants so many talents, and he expected them to invest them and bring a profit. And so that the people that were given those talents were essentially like managers of that rich man's fortune. And then it's a similar use, like it's the same word, like dispensation and stewardship. And a stewardship means that somebody's in charge of it or someone's managing it. So I'll have the word managers up there as meaning who are the primary characters involved in managing the stewardship, or that God is working through and dealing with during that particular time. So in the age of innocence, who do you think the managers are? It's not a lot of people to pick from. There was only 2 of them around at the time. Adam and Eve. They were the managers. They were the ones they were the only ones there. If they wouldn't have fallen into sin, and they could have continued on and had children and populated the earth, and they all would have been part of that. But seeing that things worked out the way they did, they didn't remain the managers for very long. And as far as the time period, who knows? Can you describe like what the time period of that was? If somebody asked you, like, well, when in the Bible was like how long did the time of Adam and Eve last? There's not really years for this, although you could throw some years in there, but if you were to describe the time, it would be from the time that God created man would be when it started, because then man existed and was able to be a manager of the dispensation. And when did it end?
Fall.
Yeah, it ended at the fall of man when they fell into sin. So what was the responsibility of the people that were in that dispensation? What instructions did God give them? What did they have to
Take
do?
care of the animals, the land,
Yep.
each other.
It's good.
Replenish the earth.
What?
Replenish the earth.
Yeah, that was one of them.
Garden.
Garden. There's a real big one that's missing.
Not to eat of the tree.
Don't eat of the tree. Right, so basically they were to obey God. He gave them several commands to keep the garden, have dominion over the animals and plants, and he specified what they could eat. He gave them the plants to eat and fruits and seeds and things. He instructed them to populate the earth, to subdue it, and most importantly, don't eat from the tree of knowledge. And with that instruction, there was a specific consequence. Like they knew ahead of time, if you eat of that tree, something's going to happen. You know, a lot of times God will reveal what he expects, and he'll give you a warning. You know, if you don't do that, you know, this is what's going to happen. You know, you're going to obey my law, or else you're going to be, you know, taken into captivity or scattered, or, you know, I'll bring your enemies against you. In this case, God specifically told them, if you eat of this tree, you're going to die. You know, so they knew that there was a consequence from eating of the tree. It wasn't like they just didn't know and went ahead and did it. They knew they were disobeying God when they did that. So each dispensation has managers, a time period, a responsibility, and it has a failure, because each dispensation ultimately ends up in a failure. So how would you summarize the failure in the Age of Innocence?
Trying to obey.
Didn't obey? Anything more specific? Anybody?
They eat the fruit.
They did. They ate from the tree. That was the ultimate failure.
Mm-hmm.
So their failure was in disobedience. They failed to obey God in the commandment not to eat from the tree, which led then to judgment. And what was the judgment brought upon them?
They had to wear skin clothes.
Yeah, I guess that would be a real bummer that worked out, you know.
No.
That's
But-
not it.
Obviously death.
Yeah, they died spiritually, and their bodies began dying physically.
Cameron's head kicked out of the garden.
Okay, yeah, that was
Yeah.
another one. There were other things too. There were several.
Working.
Yeah,
Yeah,
work
yeah.
was multiplied on Adam.
Birth pains, all that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
birth pains. It said that God said, "I will multiply your conception and the pain in it." So I think in the garden, I mean, since people would have lived forever, if people could have babies like one a year or whatever, the population would have boomed really quick. But I tend to think that, looking at that verse, that possibly you couldn't have, maybe there was a longer time period between like cycles where you could actually have children, because it says God says, "I will multiply your conception," which would indicate that maybe conception wasn't as frequent before the fall. Maybe originally, maybe every 5 years you'd have a child or something. So that would have been a result of the fall and the consequences of it. God cursed the earth, so that would sprout up weeds and thorns and make it much more difficult to tend. We have curse and death. It's a little slow tonight. There it is. And something I didn't touch on last time, but each dispensation, in spite of man's failure and judgment, God always intervenes with grace. And I didn't talk about it, but can anybody think of anything that God did to help or to show grace at the end of that dispensation, after, like, when he handed out the judgments? How is it that God showed grace? And it's okay if you don't know it, because I didn't touch on this particular point last week.
It had to do with taking away one of the trees.
I suppose that could have been. I wasn't thinking of that one, but he did protect man from eating the tree of life and living in a fallen state forever.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be something of grace. But specifically, that he did clothe them with the coats of skins, which would indicate that there was some sort of a sacrifice. And there was also a promise of, most people would call it a promise of a redeemer. I don't know how much they really understood. It just basically was a prophecy that, the seed of the serpent would one day bruise the seed of the woman's heel, but the seed of the woman would crush the head of the seed of the serpent. So there was some sort of a promise that something would happen in the future where the serpent would ultimately be defeated. And whether they understood that as a redeemer coming, it's not very clear. It doesn't, a lot of people, like I mentioned, in the Old Testament, they're looking forward to the cross, and now we're looking backwards to the cross. Well, I think that might be a bit of a stretch. I think the promise was pretty vague. It just talked about the seed, one of them overcoming the other. I don't know if they knew everything that was involved in that, but we do see the sacrifice instituted here. You see, God apparently made a sacrifice when he clothed them with the skins. You see Noah building an altar and offering sacrifices, and Abraham building an altar and offering sacrifices. You have Cain and Abel bringing sacrifices. So along with this judgment that God placed on them, he did establish some sort of a way for them to have some sort of atonement for their sins through, like, the sacrifice. And I believe that's one of the common threads through the whole Bible is a faith in a blood covering. In the Old Testament, they didn't know it was going to be the blood of the Messiah being shed, and God himself. All they had to look at were the animals, and the animals were a picture of something, but it said, like, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin. So they were looking at the blood of those bulls and goats in the Old Testament as somehow making an atonement for their sins. And now, with our further knowledge and understanding, we can see that was a picture of the death that Christ was going to die, the perfect sacrifice, and his blood would forgive all of our sins once for all. But back then, they didn't have that whole picture, so they just saw this, little picture. They just trusted in that blood. God said, if you commit a sin, bring this type of animal, and they're going to do all this with it, and a sacrifice, and make sure you bring in some salt and wine and flour, and they'll offer it in the altar, and then your sin will be forgiven. So in the Old Testament, they knew sin, like a forgiveness, came through blood of the animal, and we see that now that it was a picture of Christ. So we'll move on to dispensation number 2.
I had a thought. I wonder, in a lot of, like, kids' stories, you read of that passage, and you picture Adam and Eve with these, like, cavemen looking, like, coats of skin or whatever, like rags on them. But I wonder, like, that just got me thinking what God actually used, like what animal he used. I know there's probably, like, theories out there, but no one can really know. But
Well, typical sacrifices, like for sin, would be sheep, lamb, and goats, that type of stuff. So he may have made some sort of leather garments, or probably have been a herd animal like that, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Some sort of leather garments. I don't know. It's a good point. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I wouldn't picture. I guess we probably wouldn't be good to picture them as like a caveman, like a Fred Flintstone with just a strap down.
And about making a coat.
Yeah.
Like he made
Yeah, it was a
world.
loincloth.
Yeah, I mean, you can make some pretty cool looking stuff out of leather. So
I don't think so.
who knows what he actually made. The the expression coats, I believe, indicates like a longer garment, like flowing longer thing. I've heard some people preaching on like modesty and stuff when it said God clothed them with coats of skin, that the word coats implies like something longer, like it's not just like a short pair of shorts or just a loincloth or something. It was like a longer, like fully covering garment. And especially if you compare that to how they just sewed fig leaves together to try to cover themselves, God was like, nope, that's not enough, and he actually made like coats for them. So Adam and Eve walked around in leather coats.
Seems uncomfortable.
Something to think about.
Yeah, I think that was judgment.
And they, mankind picked up stuff pretty quick. I mean, within a couple generations, they were working with steel and brass and making instruments and tools, and they probably learned how to use cotton and stuff pretty quick to make other garments and things. So they could have undergarments under their leather coats. So the next dispensation, and these first couple of dispensations are relatively short. So, I mean, you guys know the Bible stories, but I'll go through them just because we can cover the Bible stories relatively quick, which pretty much will cover the whole dispensation. But once we get on to like Abraham and like the dispensation of the promise, there's a lot more involved there. So I'll just kind of hit the high points of those when we get to those stories. But going into the dispensation of conscience, this is right after they were kicked out of the garden. So we got mankind new on the earth, and yeah, here we are. I think that's Cain and his wife there. So I see in a lot of the dispensations, there's usually some sort of a revelation involved. I'm not going to include that in the summaries that I'll have you guys trying to memorize, but typically there's some sort of a revelation when God does something and institutes a new dispensation. He'll reveal something. So at the end of the age of innocence, God revealed that prophecy about like a coming savior or something of the seed of the woman crushing the seed of the serpent. The knowledge of good and evil was revealed. So now man leaving the garden, now they knew what's right and wrong. And that continues, and obviously until this day, it talks about in Romans how like the law of God is written upon our hearts. So there's no excuse for man to sin. They can't say, I didn't know that was right or wrong, because we have that within us now. Mankind has an innate knowledge of good and evil. You can go to the most unreached tribes in the heart of Africa, and they've never even heard of God in any way, and yet they know stealing is wrong or adultery is wrong. It's something that it became written in man's heart when they partook of that tree. The managers of this dispensation are Cain, Seth, and their descendants. Seth being the next son from Adam and Eve. And when we get into this dispensation, it follows the family line a little bit and kind of gives you an idea of the families, that the offspring of Cain and his descendants, and Seth and their descendants. So these are the people that God is dealing with now. Seth, Cain, Adam and Eve are still around, and their descendants. They're the ones that God is working through. They're the ones that are responsible to follow the instructions for this dispensation. Just to note some of the conditions now, it's a very big difference from what they had while they were living in the garden. God had cursed nature so that it wouldn't grow as well as it did before. Thorns and weeds would grow up, increased childbearing and pain in childbearing, increased labor to produce food. Man to rule over the woman was another change that came, where now there's an order of authority, where in the garden it seems like they were both working together, but in Genesis 3 it talks about part of the curse and how the man is to rule over the woman, and the serpent is cursed now. Whatever that means for us, I don't know. Just they're not flying around anymore, they're slithering around on the ground. But that's just a note on the conditions. So the instructions now, this is, if you're alive in this time period, what do you have to do to please God? What actions? Is it faith? Is it works? What is it? Is it believing in a coming Savior? Is it just faith alone? Well, in this dispensation, man has to, now that they know the knowledge of good and evil, they're responsible now to follow that, to follow their own will and their conscience. So now that they know right and wrong, God expects them to do what is right. They wanted to eat from the tree. You want to know what's right and wrong? Okay, now you know. Now put it to use, and see if you can live and do right by your conscience. And we see this when Cain and Abel are bringing their offerings to God, and we'll go through that story in a little bit. But we know that Cain has a little bit of an issue with his offering, and God isn't real happy with him. And God confronts him and tells him that if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? So this is God telling him, like, if you do good, you'll be accepted. So in this dispensation, you're to follow your conscience. You're to do good. You're to do well. If you follow your conscience and you do well, you'll be accepted. But if you don't do well, if you don't follow your conscience, here's the warning. Sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire. So God's saying, if you do good, you'll be accepted. You'll be approved of God. God will accept you. But if you don't do well, if you do wickedly, then sin is right there at the door, and it wants you. He's saying, like, he's personifying sin as like actively at the door, waiting to take over your life and have dominion over you. And then God's command, and thou shalt rule over him. So the instructions in this dispensation, do well and you'll be accepted by God, but be cautious because sin is waiting at the door and it wants you, but you are to rule over him. So you're to rule over sin and do right, and you'll be accepted. So if you were alive at this time, if you were Abel's grandchild, and, well, not Abel, Seth. Abel didn't have any kids. He kind of had a little problem there, but
were these conditions for salvation?
To be right with God.
Well,
Yeah.
how can mankind not sin?
Well, it's not that you wouldn't ever sin. There's always as I was saying, the sacrifices. So there's always a faith in the blood,
All right.
which I think it would be like an atonement for your sins.
Like the fruit and the sheep or goat that Abel.
Right, yeah. They were brought their offerings. God made a sacrifice when he clothed them.
Do you think he didn't want Cain's offering because it wasn't blood related?
I'll talk about it when we get there. We'll talk about it, but that's part of it, yeah. I have some other thoughts on it, but basically, yeah, I mean, through the whole Bible, I believe faith in God, obviously, is number one. You got to believe in God in order to have any kind of a relationship with him. And then faith in, like, the blood atonement. That's one thing you do see through the whole Bible, is some sort of a faith and a blood, like, atonement for sin. So I think, like, those two things are at, like, the foundation of your relationship with God. But then I think during different dispensations, God adds different requirements. In this dispensation, he wants you to live by your conscience and do what's right. In other dispensations, like in the dispensation of the law, God adds a whole bunch of stuff specific to Israel, and he tells them, keep my law and obey my commandments. And if you don't do these things, it talks about being, like, cut off, and your soul being cut off, and your soul being utterly destroyed. And so it would appear to me that you had to keep these other commandments, like during the time of the law, in order, it was part of salvation. And I always explained it that the law can't save you, but you can't get saved without keeping the law in the Old Testament under that time of the law. Because I believe that keeping the law kept you in a right relationship with God, so that when you died, you could go into Abraham's bosom, and there you would wait until Christ was sacrificed and died and came and preached to the souls in prison. And then they saw the fulfillment of what all the blood sacrifices were that they were trusting in all these years. They see them as a picture of Christ, who now appears to them and says, I'm the perfect sacrifice, believe in my death and burial as payment for your sins. And then he was able to lead them up into heaven after his resurrection. But we can get more into that as we get to that. So basically, this dispensation man was to follow his own will and conscience and basically do right, follow your conscience. And as I was saying, like blood sacrifices, that's you see that throughout the Bible. Everybody built altars and had some sort of sacrifice. And the consequences that we just read was that, well, let sin rule over you. If you don't do well, sin lieth at the door, and its desire is unto you. So if you give into it, sin will rule over man. So let's see what happens. There it is. And Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain. All right, it's a little graphic, you know. I'm glad the kids are good.
Ew.
He doesn't look too happy.
It's
not a boy.
Well, they weren't happy ever since they left the
Look at
garden.
her.
So,
There you go, babe.
so Adam, knew his wife Eve, she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. So they had Cain and Abel, happy little family. Like you were saying about like cavemen. So they got little bones. What's that?
Black haired one looks. That must be Cain.
I just said hair.
Oh.
The
And
blood is-
Abel
See, I knew
was
it.
a keeper of the sheep.
See, he's got a sheepy kind of hair.
On his chest or his head?
Just too.
But Cain was a tiller of the ground. So they both had vastly different career choices. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering. There it is. It's a little bit slow. Nice.
He looks mad.
He always looks mad.
But unto Cain and his offerings he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And I do believe that it has to do with the sacrifice. At the time, they were only to bring a blood sacrifice as, you know, the picture of that atonement for sin. You see all through the Bible that blood as an atonement for sin is something that's needed.
So you think he knew he was supposed to bring a blood sacrifice? Because I've heard that, like, he brought his vegetables and stuff because he was a tiller of the ground, but God knew that it wasn't his very best. It was like old, or it was whatever.
I don't know. There's nothing that would seem to indicate that. I mean, it just says that he brought from the fruit of the ground. But my personal thought on this is that the ground at this time was cursed. When God kicked them out of the garden, he said that the ground is cursed. So possibly because of that curse, maybe an offering from the ground would be something that's not acceptable. And then we see later on, after the flood, when Noah gets off the boat, God removes that curse on the ground. And then we see a little bit further, when we get into the law, bringing the first fruits of your fields is one of the requirements under the law. So in another dispensation, you are required to bring fruit to the ground. The first of your harvest, you're supposed to bring it to the Lord. So again, if you're not living in the right dispensation, you know, if you're at this time, you know, essentially if he's bringing an offering, like that would have been accepted if he would have brought it during the time of Moses, you know, or a time period of the law, as long as he was bringing it for the right reasons. You know, if he was looking to this for atonement for sin, then it wouldn't work because you need a blood sacrifice for that. But maybe it could be a picture too of man's works, because God specifically cursed the ground, and he told Adam, by the labor of your hands will you bring forth to the ground. Like, you have to do a lot of work to get the ground to produce for you. So this is maybe a picture of man trying to bring their own works to God and present them to God. And God's like, no, I don't accept the works of your hand. I only accept what you bring to me through faith in the way that I tell you to bring them. So those are like my thoughts on probably why that he didn't accept that sacrifice. So Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted, and if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. So there we get the kind of the summary of the dispensation. And God's encouraging him, telling him what he needs to do. So, a little while later, Cain
Oh.
talks with Abel, his brother. Hey, let's go for a walk in the field. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him.
So this is the result then of his sin, because he said, sin will rule over you.
Yeah.
And so since he didn't listen to God and could have changed his ways right there when God gave him the grace, this is sin taking over, and it led to murder.
Right. God said that sin was waiting at the door. And essentially, Cain opened that door opened it up, and sin was able to come in and rule on him and led him to commit the first murder, first death of man. And the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he says, I know not. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?
I hope they lied to God.
What's that?
I hope they lied to God.
Yeah, I know.
Excuse them.
I don't know. Well, Adam and Eve, they tried to hide from God. They didn't want to face him, like thinking he wouldn't know. And God said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hands. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. Something I've kind of realized is reading these accounts again, where note how Cain says here, and from thy face shall I be hid. So keep that in mind. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. So here's a little piece of mercy. Here Cain commits a murder, and God still is merciful and protects him, sends him away with a promise that nobody will slay him. Also notice, we talked about, in a different dispensation, there was a punishment for murder. And once they got off the ark, God demands the death penalty. If you kill somebody, you're executed. But here we see he murders somebody, and God just puts a curse on him and sends him away. But still has mercy on him and promises that he won't be killed by somebody that finds him. So you can see how different dispensations God works in different ways. And if you try to take something from the wrong dispensation, it won't work, and God won't be pleased with it. If somebody during the dispensation of the law commits a murder, and the authorities say, oh, well, it's all right, we'll punish you and send you on your way, God wouldn't be happy with that. But if they happened here, that would be acceptable, because there wasn't a death penalty yet here for murder. So just a very big distinction between some of the dispensations. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Cool mark. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. So I was thinking this is kind of interesting, because it says that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. And when God was first sending him away, one of his fears was that he wouldn't see God anymore, or that God wouldn't see him. And here it says that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. So I'm thinking Adam and Eve may still have had God close to them. Even after they were cast out of the garden, it still seems that God's presence may have still been very active and personal in Adam and Eve's life. Because you see here, as Cain is leaving, that was his fear. Like he says he left, departed out of the presence of the Lord. And then we'll see later that, when Seth is born, it appears that a godly line, a good line is started. And that Seth would have still been with Adam and Eve wherever they were, and God's presence may have been with them and influenced his descendants. So then we get into some genealogies. So we'll try to just get through these because they can be time consuming, but these ones aren't too bad. So Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God said, she hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Seth was 105 years old when he fathered a son and named him Enosh. And to Seth, to him also, there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So interesting that Adam and Eve have Seth, and they have a couple generations, and this is the first place in the Bible where it talks about people calling upon the name of the Lord. And this is separate. This is, Cain left and had his descendants, but then Adam and Eve have Seth and a couple generations there, and now they begin calling upon the name of the Lord. So possibly in that early time, God was still present with Adam and Eve and working in their lives, helping them or blessing them. And from that, you get Seth and these, this godly line that began. And ultimately through Seth, we get down all the way to Noah. The child?
No.
Oh, okay.
Kind of dream or something.
And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. It's not the Enoch that disappears later. It's a different one. And Cain built a city and named it after his son Enoch. Seth's son Enosh fathered Canaan, and to Cain's son Enoch was born Irad. Seth's grandson Canaan fathered Mahalalel, and Cain's grandson Irad fathered Mahujael, and Seth's great-grandson Mahalalel fathered Yared, and Cain's great-grandson fathered Methushael. Seth's great-great-grandson Yared fathered Enoch, and Cain's great-great-grandson Methushael fathered Lamech. Seth's great-great-great-grandson Enoch fathered Methuselah, and Cain's great-great-great-grandson Lamech took two wives, and the name was of the first was Ada, and the second name was Zillah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and begat sons and daughters. And we'll eventually come back to Enoch because he's a real interesting picture in the Bible of the church. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. We'll see that Enoch is a picture of the rapture, because you have like the earth being wicked and God bringing judgment in the flood, and God has some people that he protects through the judgment, and he has other people that he takes completely out of the picture before the judgment. So you have like Enoch as a picture of the church being removed from the earth before the judgment, and you have Noah as a picture of Israel being preserved through the judgment to come out on the other side and repopulate a kingdom, where Enoch goes up to heaven with God. Lamech's first wife, Ada, gave birth to Jabal and his brother Jubal, and Zillah gave birth to Tubal-Cain and his sister Naamah. Generations going on. Cain's great-great-great-grandson, Jabal, is the ancestor of all those who live in tents and raise livestock. I find it very interesting that Cain's great-great-great-grandson is known as the ancestor of all those who dwell in tents and raise livestock, because Cain didn't start off that way. Cain was a tiller of the ground and his offering was rejected. So maybe he came to some sort of a repentance and taught his sons and grandsons, if you want to please God, it's not through vegetables, it's through sheep. So it's interesting how one of his offspring is known as like the best shepherd. Cain's great grandson Jubal is the ancestor of all those who play the harp and the flute, and Tubal Cain made all types of bronze and iron tools. So they're just picturing mankind spreading out generations. Lamech had a problem with somebody and was worried that he was going to be killed and complained to his wives. And Methuselah was 187 years old when he fathered Lamech. Seth's great grandson Lamech was 182 years old when he fathered Noah, saying, "This one will bring us relief from our labor and the painful toil of our hands, because of the ground that the Lord has cursed." So they were well aware of the curse that God had placed on the ground. A little bit of prophecy there too by naming him Noah and saying that he's going to bring relief from that, because it does come true when Noah gets off the ark, that curse is removed and the ground brings forth more abundantly than it did before. Seth's great grandson Noah was 500 years old when he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So we got Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sorry, I know genealogies are a little dull, but just to kind of get an idea of who's bearing who, and we have Cain's line and Seth's line. Now we move on to the next section where we see mankind becomes completely corrupted on the earth. And so we have the genealogies, we see Cain and Seth and their families spreading out, and it just seems like things get worse and worse. It came to pass that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So we have these fallen angels taking wives among humans, causing all kinds of problems. And the Lord God said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." So we have a prophecy here. And there could be, when we're kind of like looking into end times events, and like, people we want to know when the rapture is going to happen and all that. The primary application of that obviously was God set a timeline in motion there where there was going to be 120 years and then he was going to flood the whole earth. But in the Bible, there's another type of a year, and they're called Jubilee years. And a Jubilee is every 50 years. And if you take 120 Jubilee years, it brings you up to practically today. So if this is a prophecy, because he says, "My spirit will not," this is a bad translation, but saying "my spirit will not remain in humankind," well, that could be a picture of the rapture, him taking the spirit away from the earth. So he could almost be, this could maybe be a prophecy, a dual meaning thing, that in 120 Jubilee years, God will remove his spirit from the earth. And that would be done like through the rapture. We were hoping it was going to be this year, because some people looking at the calendars were saying that this was actually a Jubilee year, but there's confusion with the calendars. Nobody really knows exactly what year it is. There's been confusion through history, but it's just a thought there. And there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them. So we see this unholy union between spirits and human women, and it produced giants. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. And the Lord said, "I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them." So we can see the the warning signs. This dispensation's headed for trouble. You know, God gave them instructions. You were to follow your conscience, do what's right, and we see the whole world has gone into wickedness, and all the thoughts of man's hearts are evil continuously. And here God's implementing his judgment on that time. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. I am about to bring waters to flood the earth and destroy every living creature under the heavens. Everything on the earth will die, and I will send rain for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe out every living thing from the face of the earth. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. And it's interesting because Noah believed God. You know, out of all the people on the planet that were wicked and evil, that God found one person that was doing right enough so that God could commune with him and give him this promise and desire to make a covenant with him. And I want to compare this to like Abraham, because we're told that when Abraham believed God, because God told him, you know, get up and go to this country that I'm going to show you, it says that Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And I think it's like a similar thing here. Like God appeared and told Noah what he was going to do, and I think like Noah believed God, and that's why God considered him righteous and was able to work through him. That's not actually like explicitly in the scripture, but I see the same type thing happening where God speaks to somebody and they just obey without question. Noah did all that God commanded him to do. God said, here's how you should make it. 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. With lower, middle, and upper decks, make a roof extending to 18 inches above the sides and put a door on the side. You'll bring into the ark 2 of every type of living creature, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of livestock. 2 of every kind of bird. 2 of every kind of creature that moves on the ground. And pairs of clean and unclean animals entered the ark. And God said to Noah, gather up and take every type of food that is eaten to serve as food for you and them. And the Lord said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. And Noah entered into the ark with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. Like that dinosaur sticking out there. And the Lord shut him in. God himself actually sealed up the doors for them. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The windows of heaven were opened, and rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. And the waters increased more and more, and all the high mountains were covered. The water rose 20 feet above the mountains. And all the living things on the earth died. The birds, the livestock, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all humankind. The Lord wiped out every living thing on the face of the earth, human and animal, creatures that move along the ground and the birds in the sky. Everything on dry land with the breath of life in its nostrils died. And I recently was studying this, and this may have been far beyond what we've even imagined. Like we read this and we think, how many people do you think died in this?
I'm shocked.
Like if you were just like in your brain when you picture this event happening, like how many people do you picture like were probably alive at this time?
Probably less than 1 million. I don't know.
But I know what you mean, because that's you get in your mind just a
Couple
just
hundred
a
thousand maybe.
you kind of think like scattered tribes and just a bunch of scattered people and groups and stuff like that.
It doesn't seem like they would have multiplied that fast after Adam and Eve and
Well, take into account that from the time they left the Garden of Eden until Noah's Ark is about 1,700 years. Now, there's a very specific equation that you can plug in some numbers. You put in like your starting population, the time period that needs to be covered, and then a population growth rate. And by using this formula, you can calculate pretty accurately how much a population will increase over a certain period of time. Like you could plug in the population of the Earth right now and project in 10 years what it's going to be. And a population growth, like 1.5%, maybe it would be like an average growth rate, 1 to 1.5%. I forget what years it was. I don't know if it was around the 50s or 60s. There was a big population boom where it hit like 2%, right? And this is in a fallen world with all kinds of political problems and sickness and disease and just all the issues, and our we only live 70, 80 years, right? So figure back between the Garden of Eden and the time of Noah's flood, 1,700 years. People were living 900 years. There was very little or no genetic defects in the human line at the time because it was still pretty fresh. There wasn't all those years and chemicals and pollutants and stuff like that cause birth defects and stuff like that. There was still a very pure genetic line. And to make a long story short, if you plug all those numbers in that 1,700 years, that formula will give you a population of about 10 trillion.
That's probably why we have so much oil in the Middle East.
And I mean,
Dead
Turns
bodies.
to oil?
Compressed.
yeah,
People
and
animals.
plant and animal matter.
Underground, if
So
it's
when they
compressed.
dig
It turns
the
into-
oil,
Can't
that's the
open.
first thing he said.
Can't
open. Wow.
Yeah, Ken Hovind. Yeah,
10 trillion.
yeah. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think that there
That's
could have
why
been
there's huge oil.
that many people, up to 10 trillion people, just using like the standard formula that we would use today to track population growth. And that's using a very conservative population growth rate of like 1 to 1.5%.
Like you said, they live 900 years.
But like,
too.
yeah, and if they're living longer, and if the Earth was, plentiful and wide open, and plenty of,
How many do we have on our Earth?
there's only 8 billion people on the planet right now. So we're talking like, 100 times more than what we have right now.
Well, the Earth was also different before the flood too.
There was more
There was more land.
Yeah, well, it was all like probably one huge landmass, I think, because it says God like gathered the lands together and he called them Earth. So you may have had one humongous landmass that people like went out and lived on. But I just thought that was mind-boggling to think like 10 trillion people. That's insane. That's like a mind-boggling number. But if you think about how population can grow over 1,700 years, just look at the population growth in the last couple hundred years. Go back 100 years and what, there was only like 2 billion, 3 billion people on the planet, and
Also,
now there's 8 billion.
A lot of these guys were taking like 2 to 3 wives, and
Yeah, I mean, there's all,
Was it really abortion,
yeah, it's another thing. No like birth control, stuff like that. So just an interesting thing to keep in mind when you think about the flood, and think about 10 trillion people, and God had trouble finding one. So like mankind left to themselves to follow their own conscience and will, it just ends in death and sin and wickedness, and that's why God had to bring the judgment. So anyway,
Question.
yeah.
When you were reading, you said that the Bible said that this happened in Noah's 600th year.
Yeah.
Does that have any type of significance regarding like the timeline? How we read about a day as being 1,000 years, 7 being over perfection.
Yeah.
Would 6 be that number of like almost tribulation in a sense?
I don't know. I mean, 6 is the number of man. You know, the Antichrist, 666. You know, it's kind of a wicked, not necessarily like just 6 is the number of man. I don't know if that be something to look into. I don't know. I haven't looked into like Noah's age, comparing it to prophecy or anything like church age or stuff like that. I mean, 600, it's still less than a day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it rained. There was judgment for 40 days and 40 nights, but it would be something to keep in mind for future study to see if it matches up with anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you know if I come across anything.
All right, thanks.
And the waters dominated the earth for 150 days. Then God remembered Noah and all the living things and the livestock that were with him on the ark. I was like, oh yeah. Like, you're reading the Bible like, oh, then God remembered. It's like, did he like get busy and like, oh yeah, we're still down there. The waters gradually receded from the earth, and the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And God said to Noah, come out of the ark, bring out every living thing, and let them breed and multiply on the earth. So now we start to see this transition now from one dispensation to another, because now we're at the end of this dispensation of the conscience. So we can start paying close attention now, like what's going to be different compared to what we were doing before. And we just had one instruction there, bring out everything and let them breed and multiply on the earth. So that's something that they need to do.
Can I just throw this out?
Yeah.
I was thinking about this. So, do you ever think like why there was no kids on the ark? I mean, Noah was like, what, 600?
Yeah.
When he got on? So if he's 600, his kids and wives, it was his 3 sons and he had 3 daughter-in-laws.
Yeah.
But there's no kids, which I find like so interesting. Like why? Because they would have been old enough to have had some offspring by then, right? Because let's say if you're 600, then that's about like a 60-year-old of our day and age, most likely,
Yeah,
right? If you're
absolutely.
900, you're about 90 and you're ready to die.
Yeah.
So if his sons were 30, right, in their 30s,
Well, I don't know. It doesn't say.
there's no birth control. There's no kids.
Maybe they had kids, but
What if they were wicked? You know, grown and had to go through the judgment because they were wicked. I don't know. The Bible doesn't talk about that. It just doesn't give us the details into that. I think maybe he did have other kids that, you know, were wicked, or maybe his sons did that were wicked. I don't know. It just doesn't give us any information on that.
Or what if he caused them to be barren just to stop the population?
Possibly to
Because
save them.
What Jacob said, this kind of goes along with it. Toward the end, before the Lord returns, there's less and less population. The numbers go down, and it says there's 1 for every, what does it say?
it's because they're gonna vaccinate us.
Well, that's because of, like, the wars, like, because like so many men are going to be killed in wars that, like, what it says, like so many women are all going to be clinging to a man to.
Like there'll be 10 women for every 1 man.
Yeah, it's because there's so many men. I mean, it's kind of like the way it is in China, you know, because they restricted female births for so
I was
long.
just throwing it out there because I just find it interesting that none of them have kids.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something worth looking into sometime, but I haven't found any more
It
information
seems
on
like
that.
the women back then were like older when they had kids, though. Like they weren't in their 30s.
Yeah, I don't know. Doesn't really give us a. We saw some like when Cain and like Seth was like 105, I think, when he had Enosh, and
Oh yeah, so maybe they were
Yeah.
older.
you know.
Maybe
so,
their cycle started when they were like 60 years old.
I don't know.
That wasn't old.
No, I know. That was like
In their prime.
a 13-year-old. If they're gonna live till they're 900, it would be, right?
Maybe. Who knows? Maybe things are a little different. Maybe it's stretched out. I don't know. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar.
That's not right.
But and here's just another picture. We see the sacrifices throughout the Bible. We saw sacrifice at the end of the dispensation of innocence. We see sacrifices here in this dispensation now. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. So we have God removing that curse that was on the ground. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, and upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things that move. So some big changes here as we're transitioning into a new dispensation. He tells his sons, he blesses them and says unto them, Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. So we see a command there to be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. And this is as we get into the next dispensation, but I'm just pointing them out as we go along. Animals now have the fear of man put in them. So prior to the flood, man and animals just coexisted. They weren't scared. You could just go out and grab a bird and grab a duck or whatever, and there was no fear there. But they weren't for food either, which is interesting, because if you had all these people tending flocks and herds, it must have just been for sacrifices or possibly for clothing, because you had Abel, who was a keeper of a flock. Kind of makes you think why would you pick that as a career if you couldn't use them for food? I guess if it was just for clothing and for offerings, that would make sense. But anyway, just that's a significant change going forward, that now animals are afraid of people, but now people are allowed to eat animals. So that's a big change. But the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. So here's another command. You can eat animals, but you can't eat the blood. You have to kill them and drain it. So it may just mean you can't just pick up a raw animal and start biting them like Ham is doing back there. And behold, I establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl of the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, and for all that go out of the ark, to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. So this covenant affects us. This isn't just for Noah. This was a covenant that God made with everything living, even animals. God swore to every living thing that he would never again destroy all life with a flood. Not that that prevents fire and meteors and all that other stuff, but just not a flood. And we have God telling Noah, Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for the image of God made he man. Death penalty instituted. And God said, This is the token of the covenant, which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. So we see the failure of this dispensation is wickedness. Mankind does not live by their conscience to do right. They choose to do evil. And we see that sin rules over the entire world. So wicked, in fact, that God has to bring a worldwide judgment and destroy almost all man from the face of the earth. We also have the supernatural getting involved there. People will debate about the sons of God and the daughters of men, and it's. I used to I was real resistant trying to accept that those were actually like angelic beings, but the more I look into it, the more it seems like something like that happened, where you had it like fallen angels reproducing with human women, and you have these giants that were produced, and they were just like abnormal, the huge people that couldn't have been produced if the sons of God referred to like the godly line of Seth. Like that's what some people will argue, that the sons of God were this godly line of Seth, and they intermarried with the ungodly line of Cain. That wouldn't have produced giants. It wouldn't have made these really strange creatures. And as we see at the time of the flood, the entire world is wicked. It's not like there's a godly line of Seth out there. I mean, even the line of Seth was wicked too. The only person that was godly was Noah. He was the only one that God could find. So we see the failure of mankind during this dispensation was wickedness. We see the judgment. There it is. God destroys all air-breathing life on earth except those that were safe in Noah's ark. And the grace that we do see is that God saves the human race through Noah and his family. And he lifts the curse on the ground afterwards. So even though mankind as a whole fails this dispensation and becomes so wicked that God has to bring judgment and destroy all life, just about, God still chooses to save the human race and not to completely destroy it utterly. And this dispensation demonstrates what mankind will do if left to his own will and conscience, which has been tainted by the inherited sin nature. So this is an example to us. If God just kind of steps back, lets man do what they're going to do, and choose their own path, this would be the end of man. So this was actually, it's an interesting dispensation, because if people just want to have God take his hands off completely and let's see what man does, this is what man will ultimately become.
You can kind of see that more clear even in our country, because when they start kicking God out of the schools and wanting to just, live the way they feel it's right, and according to their own conscience, it's like you can see. Yeah,
I think history repeats itself.
Anything goes.
Yeah. Because we see in other dispensations, like God is involved. You get into like the dispensation of the promise, where God's dealing with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he has a bunch of specific things for them to do. You get into the dispensation of the law. There's 680 some laws that the Jews are required to comply to help them to be a righteous nation. You get into the church age, we have God living within us. We have the Bible and all these instructions for us so that we can know how to live. This dispensation is a very specific one, where God just kind of like takes his hands off and say, okay, you guys have the knowledge of good and evil, do your best. And this illustrates what man will become without God being involved in any way and just left to themselves to choose their own path. A lot of people want to argue like, mankind is basically pretty good, and most people aren't real wicked and evil. Most people, are good at heart, and when you ask your average person on the street, they'll say, I think I'll go to heaven. I think I've been pretty good. But when it really comes down to it, if you don't have laws and police and penalties and the death penalty, anything to, dissuade people from giving in to their evil nature, this is what you'll get. They didn't have government here. They didn't have police and armies and militaries. If somebody wanted to steal, they could steal. There was no penalties. They wouldn't get arrested. They wouldn't go to jail. If somebody wanted to just take your land and your livestock or whatever, it was just a free-for-all. It wasn't like today. At least today, we're still under the dispensation of human government. That's why it's not just a free-for-all. People aren't, I guess people are just out in the streets destroying and burning things now, but
It's going.
it's going that way. But typically, you know, the reason people don't just walk into Walmart and just start pulling stuff off the shelves and walking back out the door is because there's consequences. We have police, we have human government in place that will punish them for doing it. But at this time they didn't. So this is what man's nature will end up if God just takes his hands off and lets man do what they're going to do. So this dispensation of the conscience, from the fall of man to the flood, I said about 1700 years. Shall we call it quits about 9:15? Okay. Well, the next one, not super long, but
How long is it?
it could be like 20 minutes, half hour. I don't know. We can wrap it up unless.
Jacob's falling asleep.
All right.
Or maybe he fell asleep. Maybe he fell asleep